Tonight you did not arrive here by accident. Something in you is searching, not for entertainment, not for distraction, but for stillness. A deeper kind of rest. The ancient Stoics, men who lived through war and exile and devastating loss, discovered something that the modern world keeps forgetting. Nothing outside you has the power to truly harm you, not circumstances, not other people, not the weight of today. For the next several hours, the wisdom of Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, and Seneca will accompany you into sleep. Words forged in real struggle, offered tonight as a quiet shelter. You do not need to memorize any of this. Simply listen, and let it clear your mind the way a slow rain clears the air. This is your refuge. Let us begin. The Stoics were not theorists sitting comfortably in academies, composing elegant arguments for other philosophers to debate. They were people under pressure. One of them was a slave who could be beaten without legal consequence. One was a soldier's son who lost everything before he turned 40. One commanded the largest empire the Western world had ever seen, and still spent his nights writing private notes, reminding himself how to stay human. What they built together, across 3 centuries and radically different lives, was not a doctrine of cold detachment. It was a survival system. And the central claim at the heart of that system, the claim this documentary will examine from every angle, is one of the most provocative ideas in the history of human thought. Nothing outside you can harm the deepest part of you without your permission. That is not a comfort slogan. It is a philosophical position with serious consequences, and it demands honest examination. Because if it is true, it changes what you worry about. It changes what you fear losing. It changes how you read the events of your own life, including the ones that hurt most. The word Stoic comes from the Greek stoa, meaning a covered walkway or porch. Around 300 break, a Phoenician merchant named Zeno of Citium arrived in Athens after a shipwreck cost him his entire cargo. By most accounts, he wandered into a bookshop, began reading Socrates, and found something so compelling that he never left philosophy. He began teaching in a public colonnade, the Stoipoikio, the painted porch, and his students became known simply as those who gathered at the porch. The name stuck for 3 centuries. What Zeno taught was this: the universe is governed by a rational principle, a logos, a coherent structure that runs through all things. Human beings are the only creatures capable of consciously aligning themselves with that structure, and the only thing required for a good life is to do exactly that, to live according to reason, to live according to nature, to act in accordance with virtue. Everything else, wealth, health, reputation, comfort, the opinions of others, the turning of events, all of it falls into the category the Stoics called indifferent. Not worthless, not irrelevant, but fundamentally not yours to control, and therefore not the proper foundation for your happiness. This sounds, at first hearing, like a philosophy designed to make peace with suffering by simply redefining what matters. Critics raised that objection almost immediately, but Zeno and his successors had a sharper answer. They said the confusion is not about what matters. The confusion is about where harm actually occurs. When something bad happens to you, they argued, the badness does not live in the event. It lives in the judgment you make about the event. The Stoics called this judgment a hegemonikon, a ruling faculty, and they believed it was the one domain where human freedom was absolute and inviolable. A fire can burn your house. It cannot, by itself, determine what that loss means to you, how you interpret it, whether you let it define your identity or your future. That act of interpretation belongs entirely to you, and if you train it carefully, nothing the world does can reach it. Zeno's school attracted serious thinkers almost immediately, and the tradition grew in precision and depth over the following 2 centuries. Cleanthes, who succeeded Zeno, was said to work as a water carrier at night to pay for his philosophical education during the day. He wrote a hymn to the universe, the Hymn to Zeus, that treats the rational order of the cosmos as something worthy of reverence, not because the cosmos is kind, but because it is coherent. Chrysippus, who followed him, was the systematizer, the one who turned a set of teachings into a rigorous philosophy of logic, physics, and ethics. He reportedly wrote more than 700 works. Almost none survived. What we have instead are the voices of 3 men who came much later and whose lives gave Stoicism a human face that abstract arguments alone could never provide. The first is Seneca. Born around 4 BC in Corduba, in what is now Spain, Seneca was educated in Rome and became one of the most celebrated writers and orators of his generation. He was also a man of extraordinary contradictions. He wrote with passion about the vanity of wealth while accumulating one of the largest fortunes in Rome. He argued that the Stoic sage is never troubled by exile, and then wrote his most moving essays while in exile on the island of Corsica. He preached moderation while serving as the principal advisor to Nero, one of the most violent emperors in Roman history. He has been called a hypocrite by critics across centuries. His defenders argue that he was something more complicated and more human, a person who understood the ideal with great clarity and fell short of it with equal honesty, and who wrote not as a man who had arrived, but as a man still walking the path. His letters to his friend Lucilius, written in the final years of his life, remain among the most direct and intimate pieces of philosophical writing ever produced. He wrote about death, about time, about friendship, about the danger of crowds and the seduction of ambition, and he wrote as if he knew Lucilius would read them in an hour, much like this one, quiet, uncertain, trying to find solid ground. The second voice is Epictetus. He was born into slavery, probably around 50 C, in Hierapolis in what is now western Turkey. His owner in Rome was a man named Epaphroditus, himself a freedman who served in Nero's court. Ancient accounts claim that Epaphroditus once twisted Epictetus's leg as a demonstration of Stoic indifference to pain, and that Epictetus calmly told him the bone would break if he continued, and when it did, simply noted that he had said it would. Whether that story is literally true or later embellishment, its point is precise. Epictetus had already concluded, long before any formal philosophical training, that his body and his circumstances belonged to the world, but his response to them belonged entirely to him. He was eventually freed, established a school in Nicopolis in northwestern Greece, and taught with such directness that students traveled from across the empire to hear him. He wrote nothing himself. What survives are lecture notes taken by his student Arrian, gathered into 2 works, the Discourses and the much shorter Enchiridion, the Handbook. His central teaching is the dichotomy of control, the division of all things into what is up to us and what is not. In his own words, some things are in our control and others not. In our control are opinion, pursuit, desire, aversion, and in a word, whatever are our own actions. Not in our control are body, reputation, command, and in one word, whatever are not our own actions. That distinction, stated plainly enough to be memorized in 30 seconds, has consequences that take a lifetime to fully absorb. The third voice belongs to Marcus Aurelius, who reigned as Emperor of Rome from 161 C to 180 C. He did not seek power, and by all accounts found it a burden. He was drawn to philosophy as a teenager, studied under several teachers including the rhetorician Fronto and the Stoic Junius Rusticus. and spent decades trying to reconcile the demands of ruling an empire at war with the demands of living as a Stoic philosopher in private. The meditations, the private journal he kept throughout his later life, were never intended for publication. He was writing to himself, reminding himself, correcting himself. The result is a document that reads less like a triumph of philosophy and more like philosophy under pressure, a man with enormous power returning, again and again, to the question of what actually matters, and finding the same answer every time. Not the empire, not the victory, not the opinion of the crowd. The quality of his own inner response to whatever he had been given to face. These three men lived across roughly 150 years. They never met. They came from entirely different stations: a wealthy Roman senator, a Greek slave, a Roman emperor. And yet they were working on the same problem, the problem that confronts every human being who has ever lived. The world is not under your control. Suffering arrives without asking permission. Loss comes before you are ready. Other people disappoint you, deceive you, leave you. Your own body fails you. Your plans unravel. And the question, the one that has no easy answer, is this: what do you do with the interior life you still have when everything outside it has gone wrong? The Stoics believed they had found something close to a complete answer, and the most unsettling part of their answer is how much it places the source of your suffering not in the world, but in the gap between what the world is and what you have decided it should be. The gap. That is where everything lives. Not in the event itself, but in the space between what happened and the story you immediately began telling about what it means. The Stoics spent 3 centuries mapping that gap with extraordinary precision, and what they found there was both liberating and deeply uncomfortable. Because if your suffering lives in your interpretation, then the uncomfortable implication is that you are, to a significant degree, participating in your own distress, not causing it through weakness or failure, participating in it through a habit of mind so automatic you may never have noticed it was a choice. This is where the Stoic teaching stops being abstract and starts pressing on something real. Consider what Epictetus called the first and most important discipline, the discipline of desire. He did not mean that you should want nothing. He meant that you should examine with absolute honesty the difference between what you want and what you actually have the power to obtain. Most human misery, he argued, comes not from being denied things, but from desiring things that were never in your control to begin with. The approval of a particular person, a specific outcome from a situation involving other people's choices, the preservation of something the world was always going to take away eventually. Health, youth, the continuation of a relationship, the survival of someone you love. These things, Epictetus pointed out without sentiment, are not yours. They were on loan, and the terror that comes from clinging to them is not a sign of how deeply you love them. It is a sign of how completely you have confused them with the source of your own stability. His students found this hard to hear. We still do. But Epictetus had lived the argument from the inside. A slave has no legal claim to his own body. Everything the world uses to measure a person's worth, freedom of movement, the right to earn and keep, the ability to make basic decisions about daily life, had been stripped from him structurally before he ever encountered Stoic philosophy. And yet his accounts of his inner life do not read like the accounts of someone crushed. They read like the accounts of someone who discovered, under those conditions, that there was an interior territory no external authority could actually enter. The Romans could own his labor. They could not own his assent. They could not reach the part of him that decided what things meant. Marcus Aurelius came to the same understanding from the opposite direction. He had everything, and what he found, recorded in the Meditations with sometimes startling candor, was that having everything offered no more protection against inner disorder than having nothing. He worried. He grew irritated. He felt the pull of vanity and the weight of grief. He wrote to himself, in the middle of campaigns and amid the daily administration of an empire stretching from Britain to Mesopotamia, reminders that sounded almost desperate in their urgency. Begin the morning by saying to yourself, I shall meet with meddling, ungrateful, violent, treacherous, envious, uncharitable men. All of these things have happened to them by reason of their ignorance of what is good and evil. That is not the voice of a serene philosopher who has transcended difficulty. That is the voice of a man preparing himself for the day ahead, stealing his interpretation before the day's events can ambush it. And here is what makes that passage so significant. Marcus was writing it as a reminder, which means he needed reminding. The Stoic ideal was not a state he had permanently achieved. It was a practice he returned to, imperfectly, repeatedly, the way anyone returns to something they believe is true but find difficult to sustain under real pressure. The Meditations are not a record of Stoic success. They are a record of Stoic effort, and that distinction matters enormously, because it means the philosophy was never designed for people who had already solved the problem of their own minds. It was designed for people still in the middle of it. Which brings the question into the present. Not the 3rd century BC, not the 1st century C. Now, the conditions that produced Stoic philosophy have not disappeared. They have changed in texture, but not in structure. You still cannot control what other people decide. You still cannot prevent loss. You still cannot guarantee that the things you have built will stand. The pace of change is faster. The volume of information about everything that is going wrong, everywhere, at all times, is louder than any Roman could have imagined. And the pressure to measure your worth by outcomes you cannot fully control is, if anything, more relentless now than it was in Nero's Rome or Marcus's campaigns on the Danube frontier. What the Stoics offer is not an escape from that pressure. They offer a reorientation inside it. The discipline they called prosoke, self-attention or watchfulness, was the daily practice of catching your own mind in the act of making judgments and asking whether those judgments were serving you. Not whether they felt true. Feelings of truth and actual truth are not the same thing. Not whether others would agree with them, but whether holding that particular thought in that particular form was moving you toward a life of greater clarity and less unnecessary suffering, or away from it. Seneca, who understood the distance between the ideal and the lived reality better than almost anyone, wrote to Lucilius about this with the directness of a man who knows he is running out of time. It is not that I have grown wise enough to stop making mistakes. It is that I have learned to notice them faster. That observation is important. The goal is not perfection. The goal is acceleration of awareness, shortening the interval between the moment you lose your footing and the moment you realize you have. And here is where the teaching reaches the first point at which it genuinely tests you, because the natural response to this framework, the one that arrives almost before the framework has finished being explained, is a version of the same objection that critics raised in Athens 2,300 years ago. What about things that are genuinely, objectively terrible? What about the losses that are not made worse by bad interpretation, but are simply, in themselves, devastating? What about grief that doesn't feel like a judgment error? What about the experience of injustice, of being harmed by someone else's choices, of watching something irreplaceable disappear? Epictetus never said those experiences were not real. He never claimed the pain of loss was an illusion. What he said was more specific and more disturbing. He said that there are two sources of suffering in any difficult experience. The first is unavoidable. It is the direct impact of what happened. The second is the story you add on top of it. The repetition, the what if, the this should not have happened, the if only I had, the it is not fair. And the second source of suffering, he argued, is often larger than the first, and it is the one that belongs to you. It is the one you can actually do something about. That is the first turning point in understanding Stoicism, not an intellectual turning point. A personal one. It arrives differently for different people. For some, it comes during a period of extended loss, when the event itself is finished, but the internal suffering continues long after, and you begin to notice, with something between relief and alarm, that the continuation is not being caused by the world anymore. The world has moved on. You are the one still standing in the wreckage, because some part of you has decided that standing in it is required, that leaving it would mean something about your love, or your character, or the importance of what you lost. And the Stoics would say, gently but without flinching, that this decision, however understandable its origins, is yours to examine. For others, the turning point comes in a smaller moment, a criticism that lands harder than it should, a delay that produces disproportionate fury, a social comparison that steals an afternoon. And you begin to ask why. Not why the criticism was offered, not why the delay happened, not why the other person has what they have, but why the internal response is so much larger than the external event seems to warrant. What interpretation is running underneath the reaction, and is it one you actually endorse, or one you inherited without ever choosing it? That question, once it becomes genuinely yours, does not go away quietly. It begins to appear everywhere, in your reactions to news, to other people's behavior, to your own history, to the uncertainty about what comes next. And the more honestly you follow it, the further it takes you from the comfortable assumption that your suffering is simply being done to you by the world, and the closer it takes you to something the Stoics considered fundamental. The recognition that the mind you carry into each moment is not a passive receiver of events. It is an active interpreter. And what it interprets, it partly creates. What do you do when you realize that the wall you have been pushing against is, in significant part, a wall you built? You tear it down. That is what the Stoics said. Not with force, not through self-punishment, not by condemning yourself for having built it in the first place. You tear it down the way you built it, one judgment at a time, by learning to examine each stone before you place it. But this is where the teaching opens into something far more demanding than it initially appeared. Because the wall is not made of obvious errors. It is not constructed from thoughts you recognize as irrational in the moment you think them. It is made from convictions that feel completely justified, from interpretations that seem not like interpretations at all, but like plain descriptions of reality. And the first revelation the Stoics deliver, the one that changes the entire landscape of self-understanding, is this: the feeling of certainty about your own suffering does not mean your account of it is accurate. Seneca addressed this directly in one of his letters to Lucilius, written when he was already in his 60s and acutely aware that his time was limited. He described a kind of person he called the unhappy wise man, someone who has learned enough to see their own patterns, but not yet enough to interrupt them. This person knows, intellectually, that their anger at a particular situation is disproportionate. They know it while they are angry. They can narrate their own irrationality with almost clinical precision. And still the anger runs. Still the distress continues. Why? Because knowing what is happening and actually changing your relationship to it are two entirely different operations. And most philosophical teaching stops at the first one and calls it enlightenment. The Stoics called the second operation ascesis, which is where the English word ascetic comes from, though its Stoic meaning is different from its later religious connotations. It did not mean deprivation. It meant practice. Deliberate, repeated, uncomfortable practice of a specific mental skill, applied under real conditions, not in the controlled environment of a lecture hall or a moment of calm, but in the middle of actual irritation, actual grief, actual fear. Epictetus was particularly insistent on this. He told his students that philosophy studied only in comfort was philosophy that would collapse the moment the world became inconvenient. What you needed was not a more complete understanding of the theory. What you needed was to have rehearsed the response so many times that it became the first response, not the considered one you reached after the automatic reaction had already done its damage. This is the point at which the Stoic curriculum becomes genuinely difficult and genuinely interesting, because it involves a set of specific mental exercises, practices that Stoic teachers assigned not as abstract contemplations but as concrete daily habits, and some of them are deeply counterintuitive. The first and most well-known is called negative visualization, though the Stoics themselves had no single term for it. Seneca described it as a practice of imagining the loss of everything you currently have, not because loss is likely, but because the imagination of loss restores the perception of value. When you hold a cup of water you have drunk from 10,000 times, you do not experience it as the extraordinary thing it is. But if you spend a moment genuinely entertaining the possibility that this cup, this water, this particular ease of ordinary morning might someday not be there, something shifts. The cup comes forward. The ordinary becomes visible again, and with that visibility comes something the Stoics considered essential, gratitude that does not depend on things going well, because it is rooted in attention to what is already present rather than in satisfaction with how things are progressing. Marcus Aurelius practiced this with almost unsettling consistency. In the Meditations, he would write about his children, his friends, the colleagues he valued, and then remind himself in the same breath that they were mortal, that their loss was not a matter of if but of when, and that loving them fully required holding that fact clearly rather than pushing it out of sight. This is not morbidity. It is a specific technique for preventing the emotional numbness that comes from taking things for granted. And it worked, not perfectly, not always, but measurably. His writing about grief, when it appears, is not the writing of a man blindsided. It is the writing of a man who had been preparing his inner ground for something he knew was coming. The second practice is harder to name and harder to perform. The Stoics called it the view from above, and it involves deliberately pulling your attention upward and outward, away from the immediate emotional texture of whatever is distressing you, and seeing it within a wider frame. Not escaping the situation, but resizing it. Marcus described this in the Meditations as a kind of mental ascent, imagining the city beneath you, then the continent, then the arc of human history, then the sweep of time in which your current difficulty occupies a space so small it can barely be located. This is not meant to make your problems feel trivial. It is meant to interrupt the automatic mechanism by which the mind treats every present difficulty as the most important thing that has ever happened, because that mechanism, unchecked, is one of the primary engines of unnecessary suffering. When you are in the middle of a humiliation, your nervous system treats it as a survival emergency. The hormonal response, the narrowing of attention, the obsessive looping of the scene, These are the same processes the body uses when physical danger is present. But a humiliation is not physical danger. The Stoic view from above is a way of communicating that information to a nervous system that does not automatically distinguish between the two. You are not dying. You are embarrassed. And embarrassment, however painfully it presents, does not require the same response as a predator. But here is where the first major complication enters. And it is a complication the Stoics themselves acknowledged, argued about, and never fully resolved. The same framework that helps you avoid amplifying your suffering through misinterpretation can, if applied carelessly, become a tool for suppression, for bypassing legitimate grief, legitimate anger, legitimate fear with a kind of intellectual override that looks like equanimity from the outside, but functions, internally, more like numbness. The Stoics had a word for the emotional responses they considered appropriate to genuinely bad events. They called them eupatheiai, good feelings, in contrast to the path, the passions or disturbances. That reason should resist. Joy was a eupathos. Caution was a eupathos. Wishing well to others was a eupathos. These were not eliminated by Stoic practice. They were considered its fruits. But the line between eliminating a disproportionate response and suppressing a proportionate one is not always clear. And the Stoics knew this. There are passages in the Meditations where Marcus sounds genuinely confused about whether he is practicing philosophy or performing Stoicism as a kind of armor. He writes about not wanting to be the kind of emperor who is unmoved by the deaths of his subjects, who processes loss so efficiently that nothing leaves a mark. That is not wisdom, he tells himself. That is hardness. And hardness is not what the philosophy is asking for. Seneca made the distinction most sharply in a letter about grief. He was writing in the wake of a friend's bereavement, and he said something remarkable for a Stoic. He said that the person who does not grieve at all has a worse problem than the person who grieves too much. The absence of grief, he argued, is not strength. It is either denial or the consequence of a connection that was never deep enough to hurt when it broke. Grief in proportion to the love is not an error in judgment. It is evidence of having loved. So the philosophy does not ask you to stop feeling. It asks you to stop adding. Stop adding the extra layer of despair about the despair. Stop adding the catastrophic story about what the loss means for your future. Stop adding the self-accusation about whether you deserved what happened. Stop adding the demand that it not have happened, which changes nothing about the past, but reliably increases the suffering of the present. What is left, once you have removed all of that addition, is something the Stoics considered genuinely manageable, not painless. Manageable, and the revelation that follows from this, the one that arrives only after you have sat with the framework long enough to test it in real conditions, is that most of what you experience as suffering is not the event itself. Most of it is the addition, the commentary, the construction you have built around the raw fact of what happened, the story about what it means, who is responsible, what it implies about the future, whether you will recover, whether you deserve to. Strip that away, and what remains is real, and finite, and survivable. But then the next question arrives, and it is the one that exposes the deepest tension in the entire Stoic project. If you become skilled at separating the event from the addition, if you learn to stop amplifying your distress through interpretation, does something also get lost? Is there a version of this practice that makes you not just less suffering, but less present, less capable of being moved by the world in ways that actually matter? The Stoics argued no. They argued that the practice of clearing away distorted interpretation did not flatten experience, but clarified it, that the person on the far side of this training felt more, not less, because they were no longer confusing the noise of their own reactions for the signal of actual experience. But this claim, for all its logical elegance, remained contested, and the contest, which began in Athens in the 3rd century BC, has not ended. The contest has a name in contemporary philosophy and psychology, and it has produced evidence that the Stoics could not have anticipated, but would almost certainly have found vindicating. It also produced evidence that complicates their position in ways that are worth taking seriously before the case for Stoicism becomes too clean. Start with what the evidence supports. In the latter half of the 20th century, a psychologist named Albert Ellis developed a form of therapy he called rational emotive behavior therapy, which he explicitly credited to Epictetus. The foundational principle was identical to the Stoic one. It is not events that disturb people, but their beliefs about events. What Ellis added was a clinical methodology for identifying those beliefs, testing them against reality, and replacing the ones that were irrational with more accurate assessments. The results were measurable. Patients with anxiety disorders, depression, and phobias showed significant improvement when they learned to catch their own catastrophic interpretations and examine them. The technique was not about positive thinking. It was not about telling yourself that things are fine when they are not. It was about accuracy, about noticing when your mind had told you that a setback meant permanent failure, that a rejection meant fundamental unworthiness, that an uncertain outcome meant certain disaster, and recognizing those conclusions as leaps, not facts. Aaron Beck, working independently in the same era, developed cognitive behavioral therapy along similar lines. By the 1980s, CBT had become one of the most extensively studied psychological interventions in history, with a substantial body of evidence supporting its effectiveness across a wide range of conditions. Epictetus had described the essential mechanism in the 1st century CE. It took Western medicine 1900 years to build the clinical apparatus around it. That convergence is not coincidental. It suggests that the Stoics had identified something genuinely structural about human suffering, not just a philosophical position, but a psychological mechanism. The mind generates interpretations automatically, rapidly, and with enormous emotional force. Those interpretations feel true. They feel like perception rather than construction. And when they are inaccurate, when they amplify threat beyond what the evidence warrants, they produce suffering that is real in its effects, even though it is partly manufactured in its causes. But here is the complication that neither Ellis nor the ancient Stoics resolved cleanly. Not every painful interpretation is a distortion. Some things really are as bad as they feel. Some losses are genuinely catastrophic. Some situations really do threaten what matters most. And the skill of identifying distorted interpretations, if practiced without careful calibration, can become a way of dismissing legitimate distress rather than distinguishing it from manufactured distress. The tool that helps you stop catastrophizing about a missed deadline can, if applied without discernment, also help you talk yourself out of the grief that is actually appropriate to a real catastrophe. It can become a kind of philosophical anesthesia, dressed in the language of wisdom. The Stoics were aware of this risk. They distinguished sharply between what they called false goods, things people typically desire that are not actually constitutive of human flourishing, and the opathei, the appropriate emotional responses to genuine value. Appropriate joy at friendship, appropriate grief at loss, appropriate caution before real danger. These were not errors to be eliminated. They were signs of a well-calibrated inner life. The problem was never feeling. The problem was disproportionate feeling, feeling that had detached from its object and begun running on its own logic. But the line between appropriate and disproportionate is one the Stoics described more easily than they demonstrated how to locate in the heat of an actual experience. And this is where the stakes of the entire project become clear, because the question is not just philosophical, it is personal. It is the difference between a practice that genuinely reduces unnecessary suffering and one that teaches you to perform equanimity while the real suffering continues underneath, unexamined and therefore unchanged. Marcus Aurelius spent 19 years as emperor. In that time he lost 5 of his children. He fought a brutal, grinding campaign against Germanic tribes on the Danube that lasted for most of his reign. He managed a devastating plague that swept through Rome and the empire in the 160s CE, killing enormous numbers of people, disrupting trade, straining the military, and testing every administrative and moral resource available to him. He also had to manage a co-emperor, Lucius Verus, whose temperament and priorities differed significantly from his own, and who died in 169 CE, possibly of the same plague that was devastating the population. And through all of it, Marcus kept writing, kept returning to the same questions, kept reminding himself of the same principles. What is remarkable about the Meditations in this context is not that they show a man who has achieved Stoic peace. It is that they show a man who found the practice worth returning to precisely because the peace was not automatic. There are entries that read like a person losing the argument with themselves. There are moments where the Stoicism sounds strained, where the reminders come too fast and too insistently, where you can feel the effort underneath the doctrine. And those moments are, paradoxically, the most compelling evidence for the value of the practice. Because they show that it was doing something real, that it was actually engaged with real pressure, and that the real pressure was not erasing it. This matters enormously when you consider the charge that is most often leveled against Stoicism by its modern critics, the charge that it is a philosophy for people in positions of relative power, that it functions as a kind of moral justification for accepting unjust circumstances that should instead be changed. If you are suffering because of systemic oppression, the argument goes, then telling yourself that your suffering is a product of your own interpretation is not wisdom. It is a rationalization for passivity. The Stoics have an answer to this charge, though it is not a simple one. Epictetus, remember, was a slave. He did not use Stoic philosophy to make peace with the institution of slavery as something just or acceptable. He used it to preserve a domain of interior freedom that the institution could not reach, while simultaneously teaching that human beings, by virtue of their shared rational nature, were all fundamentally equal in a way that the Roman legal system simply refused to recognize. His Stoicism was not a counsel of passivity. It was a survival technology developed under conditions that offered no external recourse, and it was paired with a political philosophy, the Stoic concept of cosmopolitanism, the idea that all human beings belong to a single community of reason, that had profound implications for how societies ought to be organized. The Stoics believed in acting. They believed in doing everything in your power to address what could be addressed. The discipline of action was one of Epictetus's 3 core disciplines, alongside the discipline of desire and the discipline of assent. What the philosophy asked you not to do was to attach your inner stability to the outcome of your action. You were supposed to act as fully and as skillfully as you could, and then accept the result as something that partly belonged to the world rather than entirely to you. The outcome is preferred indifferent in Stoic language. The action itself, the quality of the effort, the integrity of the means, that belongs to you entirely and is the only part of the situation you can genuinely call your own. That distinction is subtle, and it is regularly misread as passivity by people who encounter it at the level of slogan, rather than at the level of practice. The Stoic who accepts outcomes without attachment is not the same as the Stoic who does not try. They are, in fact, often freer to try harder, because they are not paralyzed by the fear of failure that comes from having made their self-worth contingent on a result they cannot fully control. Consider what this produces in practice. A person whose self-esteem depends on a particular outcome, a promotion, a relationship succeeding, a creative project being well received, will often underperform in exactly the situations that matter most, because the fear of failure activates the same cognitive narrowing that evolved to handle physical threats. The mind becomes less creative, less flexible, less capable of the subtle judgment the situation requires, whereas a person who has genuinely decoupled their sense of themselves from the outcome, who has worked for the result without being enslaved to it, often finds they can perform better, because they are not fighting their own nervous system at the same time they are trying to do the work. This is not speculation. It appears in research on performance anxiety, on athlete psychology, on the experience of creative professionals. The Stoic framework, when it actually functions rather than being performed, seems to produce something close to what psychologists now call process orientation, the ability to focus on the quality of engagement rather than the evaluation of results. And process orientation consistently correlates with both better outcomes and greater subjective well-being. But now the tension reasserts itself from a different angle. Because if Stoicism works, if it genuinely reduces unnecessary suffering and improves the quality of action, then why do so many people who encounter it feel that something essential is still missing? Why does the philosophy, even when it is intellectually accepted, so often fail to penetrate to the level where the actual distress lives? The Stoics had an answer to this too, and it is the answer that changes everything about how the practice is supposed to work. The problem is not that the philosophy is incomplete. The problem is that most people are trying to apply it at the wrong level. They are trying to think their way out of suffering. And thinking, however sophisticated, does not reach the place where the suffering is actually generated. The place where it is generated is older than language, older than reason, older than philosophy. And reaching it requires something the Stoics prescribed, but rarely described in the detail the situation demands. The body. That is the answer the Stoics prescribed, but only partially mapped. And it is the place where the entire intellectual edifice of the philosophy either connects to lived experience or remains suspended above it, beautiful in theory, unreachable in practice. Here is the mechanism. When something threatening happens, the brain processes it through a system that operates far below conscious awareness. The amygdala, a small structure deep in the temporal lobe, evaluates incoming information for threat faster than the cortex, the thinking brain, has finished receiving it. By the time you have consciously recognized that something has gone wrong, your body is already responding. Heart rate has changed. Breathing has shifted. Stress hormones are moving through your bloodstream. Muscles have tensed. The entire physiological preparation for fight, flight, or freeze is already underway, and it was triggered not by the event itself, but by the brain's rapid, automatic, largely unconscious interpretation of the event as dangerous. Now here is what this means for Stoic practice, and why it is the pivot that changes how everything else in the philosophy must be understood. The Stoics located the problem in judgment, in the faculty of assent, in the decision the mind makes about what an event means, and they were correct that this is where the intervention needs to happen. But the judgment they were describing is not primarily the slow, deliberate, verbal reasoning that happens when you sit down and think about something. It is the fast, automatic, largely preverbal appraisal that happens before the slow thinking begins. You cannot interrupt a response that is already complete by the time you are aware it has started, at least not from the level of the response itself. What you can do, and what the Stoic practices are actually doing when they work, is train the pre-conscious appraisal system directly, through repetition, through exposure, through the slow accumulation of new responses to old triggers, so that over time, the automatic interpretation begins to change, not because you have argued it out of existence, but because you have replaced it through practice often enough that a new pathway has formed. This is the pivot. The Stoic philosophy was not, at its core, a philosophy of reasoning. It was a philosophy of training. And the distinction matters enormously, because it determines what kind of engagement the practice actually requires. Epictetus used the language of athletics repeatedly. He compared the philosophical student to a wrestler or a boxer, someone who does not learn their craft by reading about it or by understanding its principles, but by repetitive practice under real conditions, by falling down and getting up, by being hit and learning to move differently, by building through accumulated experience a set of reflexes that eventually become faster and more reliable than any deliberate decision could be. He explicitly told students who came to him full of philosophical reading and clever arguments that they had mistaken the map for the territory. Knowing about Stoicism was not Stoicism. Performing Stoicism in moments of comfort was not Stoicism. Stoicism was what happened to your automatic response when someone insulted you in front of others, when a plan you had invested in collapsed, when someone you loved was in danger and there was nothing you could do. Marcus Aurelius understood this in a way his meditations reveal precisely because they are private. He was not writing for an audience. He was training. The repetition of similar themes across hundreds of entries is not a failure of originality. It is the structure of a practice. You return to the thing you are trying to build until it is built. You say it again not because you have forgotten it, but because saying it again is part of how it becomes real, rather than merely believed. This recontextualizes everything that came before in the documentary and raises the stakes considerably. Because if Stoicism is fundamentally a training practice rather than a set of intellectual positions, then the way it has been transmitted across centuries, primarily through texts read by people sitting quietly in controlled conditions, is precisely the wrong mode of transmission. Reading the meditations in a comfortable chair is not the same as what Marcus was doing when he wrote them in a tent on a military campaign with thousands of people depending on him, and everything he valued at risk. Reading Epictetus is not the same as Epictetus practicing what he taught while someone held legal ownership of his person. The philosophy was forged under pressure, and it was designed to function under pressure. Removing the pressure and keeping the words produces something that looks like wisdom, but operates more like decoration. It is a description of a practice without the practice itself. And this explains something that anyone who has spent serious time with Stoic philosophy will recognize. The phenomenon of knowing exactly what the philosophy says to do in a difficult situation and being completely unable to do it in the moment it matters. You know, intellectually, that the anger is disproportionate. You know that your self-worth should not depend on this outcome. You know that the situation is not as catastrophic as it feels, and you feel all of those things anyway, with exactly the same intensity as if you had never read a word of philosophy. And then afterward, once the situation has passed and the autonomic storm has settled, you return to the philosophy, and it makes perfect sense again. Until the next time. This is not a personal failure. It is a structural feature of trying to address a fast system with a slow tool. The rational understanding of Stoic principles operates at the level of the slow-thinking brain. The suffering it is trying to address is being generated at the level of the fast automatic system, and these two systems do not communicate the way you would expect. Knowing something in the slow, deliberate sense does not automatically update the fast automatic sense. If it did, every person who had ever read a convincing argument for the irrationality of their particular fear would have instantly stopped being afraid. The Stoics knew this, which is why they insisted on practice rather than understanding. But what they could not have known, because the neuroscience did not exist, is the specific mechanism by which practice actually updates the automatic system. And that mechanism is the second part of the pivot, the one that makes the Stoic teaching simultaneously more accessible and more demanding than the texts alone suggest. The automatic appraisal system learns through experience, not through argument. It updates its threat assessments based on what actually happens when a perceived threat is encountered. When you repeatedly encounter a situation that feels dangerous and discover, through actual experience, that it does not produce the catastrophic outcome your nervous system was predicting, the threat assessment gradually recalibrates. This is the mechanism behind exposure therapy for anxiety disorders, and it is also understood from the inside what the Stoic practice of voluntary discomfort was designed to produce. Seneca and Epictetus both advocated practices of deliberate hardship, occasionally sleeping on a hard floor, eating simple food, wearing coarser clothing, giving up comforts temporarily. These were not recommendations for asceticism as an end in itself. They were structured encounters with discomfort designed to demonstrate to the nervous system, through direct experience rather than argument, that the feared loss of comfort was survivable. Not just survivable in theory, survivable in the body, in real time, where the automatic systems could register the actual outcome and update their models accordingly. Marcus Aurelius had an unusual version of this practice available to him, one he did not choose, but that served the same function. His campaigns on the Danube subjected him to exactly the kind of hardship that his voluntary Stoic practices were designed to rehearse. He encountered the loss of comfort, the presence of death, the weight of decisions whose consequences he could not control. Not in a controlled philosophical exercise, but in the actual conditions of a war. And the meditations suggest that rather than abandoning the philosophy under that pressure, he found it more, not less, necessary. The practice had prepared the ground for the conditions, even if the conditions were harder than the practice. But here is the fallout that makes this pivot so demanding to absorb. If genuine Stoic practice requires repeated exposure to real discomfort, real uncertainty, real loss, under conditions where the outcome is not controlled and the suffering is not theoretical, then the philosophy cannot be acquired from a safe distance. And this is exactly the opposite of how most people in the modern world encounter it. The books are available everywhere. The summaries, the quotations on social media, the videos, the podcasts. The entire apparatus of philosophical content delivery has made the words of Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius more accessible than at any point in history. And the accessibility has produced something strange. A very large number of people who can discuss Stoic philosophy fluently and find it almost entirely ineffective when the situation that requires it actually arrives. Not because they are intellectually deficient, because they have been given the map and told the map was the territory. The territory is what happens in your body when your livelihood is threatened. The territory is what happens in your chest when someone you love withdraws. The territory is the 3 a.m. wakefulness when the fear arrives without warning and without an obvious object. These are the conditions in which Stoicism is either real or not, and no quantity of reading about them from a comfortable distance closes the distance. So the question that the philosophy now forces, The question that the original Stoics were pointing at with their athletic metaphors and their voluntary hardship and their insistence on practice over understanding is the one that determines everything about whether this tradition has anything to offer you specifically in the life you are actually living, with the history you actually carry, facing the losses and uncertainties that are actually yours. Not what do you know about Stoicism, but what have you practiced, and under what conditions? The fallout from this recognition is immediate and it is personal. Because the moment you genuinely accept that Stoic practice is a training discipline rather than a body of knowledge, the entire relationship between you and the philosophy changes. It stops being something you can acquire by reading and starts being something you have to earn, repeatedly, under conditions you cannot fully control. And that is a much harder proposition than most people who encounter Stoicism in its popular form are prepared for. The first consequence is the collapse of a particular kind of consolation. There is a specific relief that comes from reading Marcus Aurelius or Epictetus at a moment when things are difficult. The words feel true. The framework feels clarifying. The sense that someone has faced worse and found a way through it is genuinely comforting. And none of that is worthless. But if the reading stops there, if the comfort of the philosophy substitutes for the practice of the philosophy, then what has actually happened is that a person in genuine distress has found a very sophisticated way to defer the work that the distress is asking them to do. Seneca was alert to this danger in himself. He wrote with uncomfortable directness about the way philosophical reading could become its own form of avoidance, a method of feeling that you are addressing your interior life while actually keeping it at arm's length. He described people who had read every philosophical text available to them and had used that reading to become more articulate about their problems without becoming any more free of them. He called this collecting opinions without forming character, and he wrote it partly as a self-indictment, because he recognized the tendency in himself and knew that recognizing it was not the same as having overcome it. The second consequence of the pivot is that it forces a re-examination of what Stoic training actually looks like in practice. Not the voluntary discomfort exercises, though those matter. Not the negative visualization, though that matters too. But the deeper practice that runs underneath all the specific techniques and that none of the specific techniques work without, the practice of staying present inside difficult experience rather than escaping it through analysis. This is where the Stoic tradition intersects in a revealing way with contemplative traditions the Stoics themselves did not have access to, and where the convergence changes the picture significantly. When Epictetus described prosoche, the practice of self-attention, he was describing something that looks remarkably like what Buddhist teachers call sati, mindfulness, and what later Christian contemplatives called recollection. The common core is the same across all three traditions. You train yourself to maintain awareness of your own inner state in real time, without immediately acting on it, without immediately narrating it, without immediately seeking to resolve it. You learn to be present with your experience rather than always doing something about it. The Stoics came to this from a philosophical direction. The Buddhists came to it from a different metaphysical framework. The Christian contemplatives came to it from a third. But what they were all pointing at, with different vocabularies and different explanatory systems, appears to be the same basic human capacity, the ability to hold difficult experience in awareness without being consumed by it, not to eliminate the difficulty, not to overcome it through reasoning, but to develop enough inner stability that the difficulty can be present without dismantling the self. The reason this convergence matters for understanding Stoicism specifically is that it suggests the Stoic practices were not primarily intellectual interventions. They were attention training interventions dressed in the language of reason. When Epictetus told his students to observe their impressions before assenting to them, he was not asking them to analyze their impressions. He was asking them to pause, to introduce a gap between the automatic reaction and the response, to create enough space inside that gap to see what was actually happening before committing to an interpretation. This is the same instruction given in every sustained contemplative tradition, not because they copied each other, because they independently discovered the same thing about the structure of human suffering and the structure of the intervention that addresses it. But the Stoic tradition added something that the purely contemplative traditions sometimes underemphasized. And this is the third consequence of the pivot, the one that increases rather than reduces the demands of the practice. Attention alone is not enough. The gap between impression and assent, once you can hold it open, has to be filled with something. The Stoics propose that it be filled with reason, with the active examination of whether your initial interpretation is actually warranted. Is this catastrophic or uncomfortable? Is this person attacking me, or are they struggling with something of their own? Is this loss permanent, or is it the end of one chapter? The question is not whether the examination happens. It is whether the examination is grounded in accurate perception, rather than in the defense of a prior conclusion. And this is where the training becomes most demanding. Because the automatic systems do not yield to examination gracefully, they generate rationalizations that look like reasons. They produce what psychologists call motivated cognition, the construction of apparently logical arguments in defense of conclusions that the emotional system had already reached through faster means. The examination that is supposed to reveal distortion can instead become the machinery by which the distortion is preserved and defended. Epictetus was aware of this. He told his students that the most dangerous philosophical error was not ignorance. Ignorance can be corrected with information. The most dangerous error was sophistication in the service of self-deception. The person who is skilled enough with philosophical language to construct an airtight justification for whatever they wanted to believe in the first place. He called this using philosophy to defeat itself. And he considered it worse than not having the philosophy at all, because it produced the confidence of wisdom without any of its actual content. The countermove he proposed was accountability, not to a text, not to a philosophical system, but to actual behavior in actual situations. Theory about equanimity means nothing, he argued, compared to what you do when someone humiliates you in public. Claims about having transcended the desire for approval mean nothing compared to how your body responds when you are ignored. The philosophy has to be tested not against your best understanding of it, but against your worst moments. And your worst moments are specifically those in which the automatic systems are operating at full strength, and your rational capacities are at their most compromised. Marcus Aurelius took this accountability seriously in the most honest way available to him, which was to write his failures down. The meditations contain repeated returns to the same errors, impatience with people he found tedious, irritation at circumstances beyond his control, the pull of vanity in situations that offered him opportunities for display. He did not resolve these tendencies through his philosophy. He continued to experience them. What he did was continue to notice them, to hold them up against the standard the philosophy set, and to recommit to the practice even knowing that he would fail it again. The meditations are the record of a man who never fully arrived, but who kept walking. This is perhaps the most important corrective the Stoic tradition offers to any idealized version of itself. The endpoint of the practice is not a state of permanent equanimity in which nothing disturbs you. That state, if it exists at all in human beings, is vanishingly rare and is almost certainly not what the Stoics were recommending when they described the theoretical figure of the wise man, the Sophos. Even the Stoics admitted that the perfectly wise man was so rare as to be nearly hypothetical. What they were recommending was the practice, not the achievement, the direction, not the destination. And the direction, understood properly, is not away from the world. It is deeper into it, with better tools. The Stoic practitioner is not trying to become someone who is unmoved by things. They are trying to become someone who is moved accurately, in proportion to what things actually warrant, without the amplification that comes from distorted interpretation, and without the suppression that comes from avoiding experience altogether. The goal is calibration. And calibration, in the domain of human feeling and response, is not a state you achieve and then maintain. It is a process you engage every day, with every significant experience, for the rest of your life. The resistance to this conclusion is predictable. It is the same resistance Epictetus's students showed when he told them that understanding the Stoic categories was just the beginning, that the real work had barely started. People who come to philosophy, then or now, are often looking for a solution, a framework that, once understood, makes the problems manageable. And Stoicism offers something that looks like that. The dichotomy of control, the disciplines of desire and assent and action, the meditations with their stately confidence. It is easy to mistake the description of the practice for the practice itself. But the resistance itself is instructive, because the moment you notice that you want the philosophy to be easier than it is, that you are looking for the conceptual shortcut that delivers the result without the training, you have arrived at exactly the territory the philosophy is asking you to work in. The desire for ease, for the result without the process, is itself one of the primary objects of the Stoic examination. What are you actually desiring here? Why does the requirement for sustained effort feel like an obstacle rather than the path? What would it mean to want the practice itself rather than the product you imagine it will eventually deliver? That question, once it becomes genuine, changes the character of everything that follows. Because now the philosophy is not something you are consuming. It is something that is consuming you, examining you, turning its light back on the person holding it. And that reversal, uncomfortable as it is precisely where the tradition becomes most alive and most useful. The first countermove most people attempt is simplification, when the full weight of the Stoic training requirement becomes clear, when the demand for sustained practice under real conditions, rather than comfortable reading announces itself. The natural response is to find a version of the philosophy that fits more easily into the life already being lived. And the modern world has produced exactly that version in enormous quantities. The simplified Stoicism that circulates most widely in popular culture today retains the most photogenic elements of the tradition and discards the most demanding ones. It keeps the dichotomy of control compressed into a two-circle diagram that has been reproduced on motivational posters and productivity apps. It keeps the more quotable passages from Marcus Aurelius, the ones that sound like self-help principles when separated from the 19 years of military campaigns and personal grief from which they emerged. It keeps the general idea that you should not worry about what you cannot control, which is not wrong as far as it goes, but which goes much less far than Epictetus intended. What the simplified version discards is the training, the voluntary hardship, the accountability to actual behavior in actual difficult moments, the examination of desire not just in the abstract, but in the specific form that desire takes in your specific life, which requires a degree of honest self-knowledge that is genuinely uncomfortable to develop and impossible to acquire through reading alone. And it discards the cosmopolitan dimension of Stoic ethics, the insistence that the commitment to reason and virtue extends to all human beings equally, which has consequences for how you treat people far beyond your immediate community that the philosophy takes seriously, and that most popular versions quietly omit. The result is a philosophy that is very effective at making people feel that they are working on their interior lives while leaving those interior lives largely undisturbed. It provides the vocabulary of self-examination without requiring the examination. It offers the idea of equanimity without the years of practice that produce anything genuinely resembling it. And it does this in a way that is difficult to criticize from inside the tradition, because the tradition itself is invoked to justify the simplification. You are told you are practicing Stoicism, and the evidence offered is that you understand the dichotomy of control and have learned to distinguish between what is up to you and what is not. But Epictetus specifically warned against this. He described students who had learned the categories perfectly and applied them to situations they did not care about, while remaining completely at the mercy of their emotional reactions in situations they did care about. The philosophy, he said, must be tested in the places where it is hardest to apply, not because difficulty is virtuous in itself, but because the places where it is hardest to apply are the places where the training either works or it does not. The wider consequence of the simplified version spreading faster and further than the demanding version is that Stoicism has acquired a reputation in some quarters for being a philosophy of emotional suppression. Critics who encounter the popular form, with its emphasis on not letting things affect you and its diagrams sorting life into what you can and cannot control, reasonably conclude that what is being recommended is a kind of managed numbness, a way of withdrawing from the full texture of experience in the name of peace. And they are, to a significant extent, correct about the popular form. The criticism does not reach the original teaching, but the original teaching has become harder to find underneath the simplified version that now speaks in its name. Seneca saw a version of this problem developing in his own time, though the mechanism was different. He wrote about the difference between a philosopher and someone who had learned to talk like a philosopher, and he was not flattering about the latter category. He described people who used philosophical language to perform wisdom in public, while remaining privately governed by exactly the fears and desires the philosophy was supposed to address. He called the gap between public performance and private condition a form of self-betrayal more serious than ordinary ignorance, because it had the additional quality of preventing you from seeking genuine help. If you believe you already have the answer, you stop looking for what is actually missing. The second countermove, which arrives when the simplified version proves insufficient, is more sophisticated and more interesting. A growing number of people who come to Stoicism seriously, who stay with it long enough to encounter its genuine demands, begin combining it with practices from other traditions in an attempt to reach the levels of the interior life that the philosophical approach alone does not touch. Specifically, many serious contemporary practitioners of Stoic philosophy pair it with some form of contemplative practice, meditation in the secular mindfulness tradition, contemplative prayer, somatic awareness work, or practices drawn from Stoic-adjacent ancient traditions such as Neoplatonism. This is not arbitrary eclecticism. It is a response to a real gap in the tradition as it has been transmitted. The Stoics described the state of the trained mind with great precision. They were less systematic about the specific mechanisms by which ordinary minds could be brought to that state, beyond the general prescription of practice and the more specific exercises like negative visualization and the view from above. The contemplative traditions, particularly the Buddhist ones that have been most extensively studied in modern neuroscience contexts, provide something the Stoic texts largely lack: a detailed phenomenology of the training process itself, a map of what happens in awareness as the practice develops, what obstacles arise at which stages, and what kinds of attention can navigate those obstacles. When practitioners bring these two traditions into contact, something interesting happens. The Stoic framework provides a robust ethical orientation and a sophisticated account of judgment and assent that many purely contemplative traditions under-theorize. The contemplative practices provide a depth of training in sustained attention and non-reactive awareness that the Stoic exercises, at least as they have come down to us in the texts, do not fully develop. Each tradition provides what the other is missing, and the combination produces something that looks more like the integrated practice the original Stoics were pointing at than either tradition produces on its own. But this synthesis also creates a new problem, and it is one the original Stoics would have recognized immediately. The combination of philosophical sophistication and genuine contemplative depth is now being assembled by individuals without the institutional support that both traditions originally provided. The Stoic schools were communities. The teaching happened in dialogue, under observation, with teachers who could see where individual students were deceiving themselves and interrupt it directly. The Buddhist monasteries were communities too. The sustained attention practices developed in conditions of structured support, with teachers who had been through the same process and could recognize the specific forms of self-deception that arise at each stage of training. What the modern inheritor of both traditions typically has is books, podcasts, and apps. The individual cultivation of practices that were designed for communities. And the consequences of this are significant, because one of the things the original community structures provided in both traditions was the accountability that prevented the training from being absorbed into the very patterns it was supposed to transform. Without that accountability, without a teacher or a community that can see you as you actually are rather than as you present yourself, the risk that Seneca identified, the risk of using philosophical sophistication to defeat itself, becomes much larger. You can construct an elaborate personal practice that is entirely organized around your comfort preferences. You can meditate in ways that produce pleasant states rather than genuine insight. You can read Stoic philosophy in ways that reinforce your existing views rather than challenging them. You can do all of this while telling yourself and others that you are engaged in serious inner work, and there may be no one in a position to tell you otherwise. The Stoics had a specific practice designed to address this vulnerability. They called it the examination of the evening. It comes from Pythagoras originally, but was adopted and described by several Stoic writers, most extensively by Seneca, who wrote about it in detail in a letter to Lucilius. The practice involved a systematic daily review of your own conduct, not a general evaluation of whether you had been a good person, but a specific, detailed accounting. Where did you fall short of what you know to be right? Where did you act from impulse rather than judgment? Where did you say what was easy rather than what was true? Where did you avoid a difficult situation that required engagement? The purpose was not self-punishment. It was calibration, a daily realignment of the gap between your stated values and your actual behavior, kept honest by the discipline of specificity. The specificity is what makes it work and what makes it uncomfortable. It is easy to conclude, in a general review, that today was acceptable. It is much harder to maintain that conclusion when you are asking specific questions about specific moments. The conversation where you said what you knew the other person wanted to hear, rather than what you actually thought. The decision you deferred not because more information was needed, but because the decision was difficult. The irritation you expressed that was disproportionate to what actually happened. These are the places where the practice lives or dies, and without the specificity, the evening examination becomes another form of comfortable self-assessment, which is another form of the original problem. The evidence that the situation is more deeply rooted than any single countermove can address comes from this: that the three most sophisticated countermoves available within the tradition, genuine training discipline, integration with contemplative practice, and structured daily accountability, are each individually demanding enough that most people who attempt them abandon one or more within weeks. Not because the practices fail when they are applied, but because the practices, when genuinely applied, produce exactly the friction they are designed to produce. They make visible the things you were managing not to see. They generate discomfort in places you had learned to keep comfortable. They ask you to be accountable in ways that your existing habits of self-assessment were constructed to avoid. And that friction, when it appears, feels like failure. It feels like evidence that the practice is not working. It produces the exact response that the practice was designed to train you out of: the interpretation of difficulty as a sign that something has gone wrong, rather than a sign that something is going right. The depth of the problem is this: the very mechanism that the philosophy is trying to transform is the one that evaluates whether the transformation is happening. The mind that generates distorted interpretations of external events will also generate distorted interpretations of the training process itself. It will declare the practice insufficient when the practice is demanding. It will declare progress when progress is being performed rather than achieved. It will use philosophical sophistication to construct accounts of its own development that are more flattering than the evidence of actual behavior warrants. Epictetus described this as the final obstacle, not ignorance, not lack of practice, but the mind's extraordinary capacity to turn every tool of self-improvement into a new instrument of self-maintenance. And here is where it gets significantly worse. Because the problem is not just that individual practitioners can deceive themselves about the quality of their practice. The problem is that the transmission of the philosophy across centuries has created a series of cumulative distortions, each one reasonable in its own context, each one adding another layer between the original teaching and the person attempting to apply it now. And when you map those distortions in sequence, you discover that almost everything most people believe they know about Stoicism is at least partially wrong, and some of it is wrong in ways that make the suffering it is supposed to address considerably worse rather than better. The first distortion entered the tradition almost immediately after the original Stoic schools closed. Stoicism was absorbed into Roman culture with enormous enthusiasm during the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, but it was absorbed selectively. The aspects of the teaching that aligned with Roman aristocratic values, self-control, endurance of hardship, indifference to physical comfort, civic duty, these were emphasized and celebrated. The aspects that cut against Roman social assumptions, the cosmopolitan equality of all human beings, the critique of excessive wealth and political power, the insistence that virtue was the only genuine good, and that therefore a slave who had virtue was superior to an emperor who lacked it, these were quietly de-emphasized. What survived the absorption into Roman culture was a Stoicism that had been trimmed to fit the requirements of a hierarchical society that found its egalitarian implications inconvenient. The selective transmission was not a conspiracy. It was the natural process by which any powerful idea is domesticated by the culture that adopts it. The ideas that reinforce existing power arrangements are found useful. The ideas that challenge them are found impractical, or misguided, or suitable for philosophers, but not for ordinary life. And the result is that what gets passed forward is not the original teaching, but a simplified version that has been made compatible with the assumptions the original teaching was partly designed to challenge. The second distortion arrived during the Renaissance and early modern period, when Stoicism was rediscovered by European scholars and enthusiastically adopted. Once again, the ethical framework was extracted from its philosophical foundations and applied to practical life. The Stoic language of virtue, of reason, of controlling the passions mapped neatly onto existing Christian moral frameworks and was incorporated into a tradition of moral self-improvement that was already well established. But in this incorporation, the Stoic insistence that virtue was sufficient for happiness, that nothing external was genuinely good or bad, was modified significantly. The Christian framework retained a robust sense of genuine goods and genuine evils in the external world. The hybrid that resulted preserved the Stoic practices of self-discipline while abandoning the metaphysical foundation that gave them their original meaning. This matters because the Stoic practices are not arbitrary. They are not recommendations for self-improvement in the general sense. They are specifically designed around the premise that the only genuine good is virtue, which means that practicing them in a framework that takes other things to be genuine goods will produce different results than the Stoics intended. The negative visualization practice, for example, makes its deepest sense within a framework where you are trying to see that the things you fear losing are not actually constitutive of your well-being. In a framework where those things are genuine goods, the practice becomes merely a preparation for loss, which is useful but considerably shallower than what Epictetus was pointing at. The third distortion is the most recent and the most consequential, because it has occurred at the largest scale in the shortest time. The popular Stoicism of the 21st century. The version that has spread through books and podcasts and social media has completed the process of separating the practices from the philosophy. What most people now encounter as Stoicism is a collection of cognitive techniques for managing stress and improving performance, packaged in the language of ancient wisdom. The dichotomy of control as a productivity tool, negative visualization as a method for reducing anxiety about outcomes, the meditations as a source of morning motivation, Epictetus's Enchiridion as a framework for personal resilience. None of these uses are wrong, exactly. The practices do work at that level. They do reduce some forms of unnecessary suffering, but they produce the cognitive equivalent of taking a powerful medicine at a fraction of the prescribed dose. You get some effect. Not enough to know whether the full dose would have done something transformative, and just enough to conclude that you have tried the treatment, when in fact you have tried a version of it that was never designed to produce the results you needed. The cumulative effect of these three distortions is that the Stoicism most people encounter is missing three things that the original teaching considered foundational. First, the metaphysical claim that virtue is the only genuine good, which provides the logical basis for the indifference to externals that the practices are supposed to produce. Without this foundation, the practices float free of any coherent account of why you should perform them, or what they are ultimately for. Second, the political dimension, the cosmopolitan insistence that the commitment to reason and virtue entails obligations to all human beings, which prevents the philosophy from being used purely as a tool for individual optimization while the surrounding world is left unexamined. And third, the community context, the dialogic, accountable, relationship-embedded practice that was the actual medium in which the original teaching was transmitted, and that no text, however carefully read, can fully replicate. Now comes the revelation that changes the interpretation of everything that has come before it. Because once you see the three distortions clearly, you realize that the question this documentary has been exploring, whether anything outside you can harm you, is not a question with a simple yes or no answer. It is a question whose answer depends entirely on which level of yourself you are talking about. At the level the Stoics called the hegemonikon, the ruling faculty, the part of you that makes judgments and gives or withholds assent, the answer is genuinely no. Nothing outside can reach that level without passing through your interpretive system. Your enemies cannot touch it. Circumstances cannot touch it. Loss cannot touch it directly. Only your own assent, your own judgment about what things mean, can determine what happens in that inner space. But that faculty does not operate in isolation. It operates in a body with a history, in a set of relationships, in a community that shapes what interpretations feel natural and what desires feel appropriate. And those conditions, the body, the history, the relationships, the community, are not purely external in the way that weather or another person's behavior is external. They are partly constitutive of who you are. They are the medium in which the ruling faculty developed and in which it continues to operate. And in that sense, what happens to the body, to the relationships, to the community, is not entirely separate from what happens to you. The Stoics knew this at a philosophical level, and it created a tension in the tradition that was never fully resolved. If the only genuine good is virtue, then a person who is tortured but virtuous is happy. Epictetus said something very close to this. But the body undergoing the torture is not simply an indifferent external circumstance. It is the vehicle through which the ruling faculty exists. Damage it sufficiently, and the ruling faculty cannot function. The Stoics had no fully satisfying answer to this because the question exposes a genuine limitation in the framework, not a flaw in the logic, but a gap between the logical conclusion and the reality of embodied human existence. The stakes of this revelation are highest in the specific context where Stoicism has become most popular in contemporary life, the experience of serious psychological suffering. When Stoic ideas are applied to depression, to trauma, to the forms of suffering that are rooted not in distorted interpretation of ordinary events, but in genuine damage to the systems that generate interpretation, the framework's limitations become not just philosophical but potentially harmful. A person whose suffering is primarily the result of cognitive distortions, of the kind that Albert Ellis and Aaron Beck described, is well served by Stoic adjacent practices that examine and correct those distortions. But a person whose suffering is rooted in physiological dysregulation, in the aftermath of trauma that has altered the basic threat detection systems of the brain and body, is not primarily suffering from bad philosophy. They are suffering from a changed nervous system. And asking that nervous system to examine its own distortions without first providing it with the conditions in which it can do so safely is asking for a kind of reasoning that the system cannot currently perform, because the very capacity for that reasoning has been compromised by the injury. The Stoics could not have known this because the relevant neuroscience did not exist. But the implication for anyone applying their philosophy now is significant. The question of whether anything outside can harm you is not an abstract philosophical question. It is a question that has a different answer depending on the state of the nervous system asking it. For a nervous system that is basically intact and operating within its normal range, the Stoic answer is largely correct, and the practices work as described. For a nervous system that has been significantly altered by sustained threat, abuse, or loss, the Stoic answer is not wrong, but it is incomplete, because it addresses a level of the person that is currently inaccessible to the intervention being applied. Seneca, who understood something about suffering that the more systematic Stoics sometimes missed, came closest to acknowledging this. He wrote that philosophy begins not in argument, but in pain, that the person who comes to philosophy without having been genuinely broken by something has not yet arrived at the situation that makes philosophy necessary. And in this he was pointing at something the tradition would not fully articulate for another 1900 years, that the need for the teaching and the capacity to receive the teaching are not always present at the same time. that the conditions which create the need can also temporarily destroy the capacity, and that the task of the philosophy in those moments is not to demand a readiness that cannot yet exist, but to wait with the person until enough safety has been restored that the actual work can begin. This is the decisive threshold. This is where everything the tradition has built, all the sophistication of the judgment theory, all the elegance of the dichotomy of control, all the careful mapping of what is and is not in our power, arrives at the question it cannot answer from inside its own framework. What do you do when the instrument of Stoic practice, the mind that observes and examines and withholds assent, is itself the thing that has been damaged? What does the philosophy offer when what is needed is not wisdom, but repair? The answer the Stoics give to this question, once you find it, is not where most people look for it. It is not in the theory, it is not in the most quoted passages, it is in the lives themselves. In what actually happened to the three main voices of the tradition when they were brought to the threshold where the philosophy's limits became visible, where the question was no longer intellectual but survival, and where what was needed was not more clarity about the dichotomy of control, but something prior to clarity, something more like ground. Seneca reached that threshold in 65 C. He had been Nero's advisor for years, had navigated the increasingly erratic and violent demands of an emperor who had murdered his own mother, and who surrounded himself with people capable of anything. Seneca had stayed close to power longer than was probably wise, his critics said for financial reasons. His defenders said because he believed his proximity reduced the damage Nero would otherwise have caused. The truth is probably that both things were true simultaneously, and that Seneca was living the exact tension he had written about for decades. The gap between the Stoic ideal and the compromised reality of a person trying to act virtuously inside a corrupt system. When the order came, in the spring of 65 C, it came as part of a broader sweep against a conspiracy that may or may not have included Seneca. Nero ordered him to die. The account of his death comes from Tacitus, writing several decades later. And while Tacitus cannot be treated as a verbatim reporter, the broad outlines are considered historically reliable. Seneca opened his veins in the Roman fashion. He spoke to his friends, asking them to mourn less and remember that his life had been its own argument. He reminded them of the philosophy he had spent 40 years writing about. The death was slow, and it was witnessed, and by the accounts we have he met it with the composure he had recommended to others for decades. What makes this historically significant, rather than just personally moving, is what it reveals about the actual function of the practice, rather than the theory. Seneca did not die unafraid. He died while managing fear, which is a completely different thing and far more instructive. The practice had not eliminated the fear. It had given him a relationship to the fear that allowed him to remain present inside it rather than being completely consumed by it. He could still speak. He could still think about others. He could still enact his values in the final moments available to him, not because the fear was absent, but because the training had made a space inside the fear that the fear could not close. This is the first major resolution of the promise the documentary's hook made. The question of whether anything outside can truly harm you now has a more precise answer. The Stoics were correct that the innermost domain, what they called the ruling faculty, cannot be reached by external events directly. But they were also right, in a way their most systematic statements sometimes obscure, that this domain is not automatically protected. It is cultivated. It is trained. And the training is precisely the practice of maintaining a space inside difficult experience that remains oriented toward virtue, toward clarity, toward the quality of response, rather than being entirely consumed by the experience itself. Seneca's death is evidence for the position, not proof of it. One instance does not establish a general principle, but it is evidence that the practice, under conditions of maximum pressure, produced something genuine rather than merely something that sounded genuine in letters written from comfortable circumstances. And evidence of that kind, from a life rather than from an argument, is a different order of testimony than any philosophical demonstration can provide. The second resolution comes from Epictetus, and it arrives not at death but in the structure of his entire life. Consider what it means that the most systematically rigorous articulation of Stoic teaching in the entire ancient record came from a man who had been a slave. This is not incidental. It is not merely an interesting biographical detail. It is the philosophical argument made flesh. Epictetus's life was the demonstration, over decades, that the claim he taught was not a comfortable abstraction for people with the luxury of philosophical education, but a survival capacity that had developed under conditions that stripped away every external good the Stoics classified as indifferent. He had no property. He had no legal freedom for a significant part of his life. He had no control over where he lived, what work he did, who he was required to serve. And in those conditions he discovered, not through reading but through the direct pressure of necessity, that there was a territory inside human experience that those conditions could not enter. Not easily, not automatically, not without sustained practice, but genuinely. The territory was real. The freedom it offered was real. And his entire teaching career was devoted to pointing other people toward it, people who had far more external freedom than he had ever possessed, and who were, paradoxically, often less free inside. This is where the Stoic claim about harm reaches its most powerful formulation. The question is not whether external events can cause pain. They can. They cause it reliably, and sometimes devastatingly. The question is whether they can determine what you do with the pain, whether they can reach the faculty that decides what the pain means, how to respond to it, what to build from it, who to remain in the face of it. And the answer the Stoic tradition gives, with Epictetus's life as its strongest evidence, is that they cannot. Not if the faculty has been trained. Not if the practice has been real rather than performed. Not if the engagement with difficulty has been sustained rather than selective. But the third resolution, the one that comes from Marcus Aurelius, is more complicated and in some ways more important. Because Marcus did not die as testimony to the philosophy, and did not live as an argument against the possibility of distortion and failure. He lived as an ongoing, documented struggle with the gap between the ideal and the actual. And what the meditations ultimately show, across their entire length and their entire arc of composition, is something that neither the simplified popular version of Stoicism nor its harshest critics tend to acknowledge. The philosophy worked not by producing perfection, but by preventing collapse. Marcus Aurelius governed the Roman Empire for 19 years under conditions that would have justified psychological disintegration in most people. He fought a war that lasted most of his reign, in terrain that was difficult, against enemies who were skilled, with supply lines that were always uncertain and losses that were always significant. He managed the Antonine Plague, whose total death toll across the empire is estimated by historians to have reached anywhere from 5 million to perhaps twice that number. An absolute catastrophe of public health that had no parallel in Roman history. He dealt with administrative corruption, with advisors who served their own interests, with the constant pressure of decisions whose consequences he could not fully foresee or control. And he lost children, multiple children, in a time when child mortality was already devastatingly common, but when each loss was still an individual grief that no statistical context could make easier. The meditations do not show a man who processed all of this without disturbance. They show a man who processed it while remaining functional, oriented toward virtue, and genuinely attentive to the well-being of others, rather than retreating into the privileges his position offered. The philosophy did not make him invulnerable. It made him, by the available evidence, significantly more resilient than the conditions warranted, and more attentive to the quality of his inner life than the external demands of his position required him to be. This is what sustained Stoic practice actually produces in a person who does it seriously over a long period of time, under real conditions rather than comfortable ones. Not immunity from pain, not the absence of fear or grief or anger, but a relationship to those experiences that preserves the capacity for orientation, for choice, for values-consistent action, in conditions that would otherwise make all of those impossible. The Stoic ideal of the wise man, completely unmoved by external events, is almost certainly a theoretical limit rather than a description of any actual human being. But the direction that limit points is real, and movement in that direction produces real and measurable differences in how a person navigates difficulty. Now comes the resolution of the causal question that has run through the entire documentary, the question of why the philosophy succeeds when it does and fails when it does. The answer is this: it succeeds when the practice is genuinely practiced rather than intellectually understood, when it is applied under the conditions that make application difficult rather than only in the conditions that make application comfortable, and when it is embedded in a life that includes some form of accountability to actual behavior rather than only to stated intention. It fails, or rather it produces the appearance of success while leaving the underlying patterns undisturbed, when it is approached primarily as a set of ideas to be understood, when it is practiced selectively in easy situations and abandoned in hard ones, and when the practitioner has no relationship to anyone who can see them clearly enough to hold the mirror up to the gap between their philosophical self-presentation and their actual conduct. These conditions for success and failure are not mysterious. They are the same conditions that determine whether any serious practice of any kind produces genuine transformation, or merely the performance of transformation. The Stoics describe them very clearly. Most of what has been written about Stoicism in the past 20 years has quietly set them aside in favor of something more immediately accessible and less demanding. But the evidence from the 3 lives examined here, Seneca's death, Epictetus's teaching, Marcus's reign, points in a consistent direction. The practice works, not perfectly, not uniformly, not without a sustained investment that most people are not initially prepared to make. But it works in the specific sense that matters most. It produces, in people who do it seriously, a greater capacity to remain themselves under pressure, to continue acting from their own values when circumstances create the maximum incentive to abandon those values, to find, inside experiences that feel overwhelming, the small space of orientation that makes the next right action possible. That capacity is not everything. It does not solve the problems the Stoics classified as genuinely external and genuinely beyond the reach of the ruling faculty. It does not address systemic injustice by itself. It does not heal physiological damage through argument. It does not make grief shorter or loss less real. The Stoics were not claiming any of those things, whatever the simplified popular version suggests. What they were claiming, and what the evidence of their lives supports, is considerably more specific and considerably more available. Inside every experience of difficulty, no matter how severe, there is a quality of response that remains yours to determine. The response may be severely constrained by the difficulty. The space available for it may be very small, but it is there. And the practice of Stoicism, genuine Stoic practice, is the development of the capacity to find that space and act from it, even when the conditions make doing so extremely difficult. This is what Epictetus meant when he said that some things are up to us and some things are not. Not that the things that are not up to us do not matter, or that we should not care about them, or that working to change unjust conditions is philosophical error, but that within any set of conditions, no matter how constrained, there is a residual freedom of response that belongs to no one else. That freedom cannot be taken from you by any external event. It can be surrendered, habituated away, buried under layers of automatic reaction and distorted interpretation until it is practically invisible. But it is there, and it is yours. The question that remains, the one that the resolution of the central narrative raises rather than closes, is what it takes to find it again once it has been buried. Because for many people who encounter this philosophy in moments of genuine need, the freedom Epictetus is describing feels not just distant, but unreal. Not because the philosophy is wrong, but because the distance between where they are and where the practice requires them to be is larger than any single recognition can bridge. Something is needed that the texts alone cannot provide, and that the training disciplines can only partially supply. Something that the Stoics pointed at with their insistence on community and accountability, but never fully named. Something that the three great voices of the tradition all demonstrated in their lives, but rarely articulated directly. The thing that the Stoics pointed at but never fully named is relationship. Not relationship as a social comfort or an emotional preference, but relationship as the medium in which the ruling faculty is actually formed and reformed. This is the piece that the transmission of the philosophy through texts consistently loses, because texts by definition remove the relational dimension and deliver the content to a solitary reader in isolation. And solitary reading, however deep and however sincere, cannot fully replicate what happens when a human being is genuinely witnessed by another human being who holds them to what they say they believe. The ancient Stoics taught in dialogue. Epictetus's school in Nicopolis was not a lecture hall in the modern sense. It was a community of practice, where students lived in close enough proximity to each other and to their teacher that the gap between philosophical aspiration and actual behavior was difficult to sustain for long. When Epictetus challenged a student, he was not challenging an abstraction. He was challenging a specific person whose specific patterns of self-deception he had observed directly over time. The discourses that Arrian recorded are full of moments where Epictetus catches a student performing wisdom rather than enacting it, where he names the specific form of evasion happening in the conversation rather than addressing only the stated question, where the teaching operates at the level of what is actually happening rather than what the student has been willing to bring forward. This is what modern readers encounter as sharpness in Epictetus. His language is often blunter than Seneca's, less elegant, more confrontational. But the confrontation is not gratuitous. It is diagnostic. He is naming what he sees because he can see it, because the student is physically present, and because the philosophy only becomes real when it is applied to what is actually present, rather than to the more comfortable version of oneself that one brings to private philosophical reading. Marcus Aurelius had a version of this in his philosophical mentors, particularly Junius Rusticus, whom he credited in the Meditations with giving him a copy of the Discourses, and with something harder to name but equally important, a model of how a person actually lives the teaching rather than merely professing it. He wrote about Rusticus with a specificity that makes clear he was not describing an abstract philosophical influence, but a witnessed life, a real person who demonstrated in real circumstances what it looked like to bring Stoic values into daily conduct. The witnessing ran in both directions. Rusticus saw Marcus, and being seen by someone you respect, being held to a standard by someone who knows you well enough to know whether you are meeting it, creates a pressure that no amount of private reflection can replicate. The consequence of the tradition being transmitted primarily through texts for the past 18 centuries is that this relational dimension has been almost entirely stripped out. What remains is doctrine and practice technique, both of which are genuinely valuable, but neither of which carries the full weight of the original pedagogy. And the result is a philosophy that tends to be applied most consistently by the people who need it least, and most inconsistently by the people who need it most, because the people who need it most are typically in conditions of sufficient distress that the solitary application of philosophical techniques is the hardest possible mode of engagement. This is not a failure of Stoicism. It is a failure of transmission. The difference matters because it changes what the appropriate response is. If the philosophy itself were insufficient, the answer would be to look for a different philosophy. But if the philosophy is sound and the transmission is incomplete, the answer is to ask what the transmission is missing and whether any of it can be recovered. Some of it can. The contemplative communities that have preserved lineages of sustained practice across Buddhist, Christian, and other traditions have maintained something of the relational pedagogy that the ancient schools had, the practice of working with a teacher or a spiritual director, of having your specific patterns examined by someone who has been through the territory and recognizes the particular forms of self-deception that arise at different stages. This is structurally similar to what Epictetus was doing with his students, and what Marcus's relationship with Rusticus provided. It does not require accepting the metaphysical framework of any particular tradition. What it requires is accepting the principle that self-examination without external accountability is incomplete, and that the completeness matters. Some of it can also be recovered through more secular means. The psychotherapy relationship, at its best, provides something structurally similar, a witnessed and accountable examination of the gap between stated values and actual behavior, conducted with someone who is not invested in the flattering self-presentation, but in the accurate one. The specific language differs completely from the Stoic vocabulary, but the underlying function, the creation of conditions in which the automatic patterns of self-deception become visible and can therefore become objects of examination rather than invisible operators of behavior, is recognizably the same. And here is the final, surprising detail, the one that changes the broader interpretation of everything that has been explored in this documentary. It comes not from the ancient texts or from modern neuroscience, but from the biography of the tradition itself. When scholars examine the full historical record of Stoic influence across Western culture, they find the philosophy consistently appearing in moments of extremity, not luxury. Not primarily in the studies of comfortable readers who adopted it as a framework for personal optimization, but in prisons, hospitals, military campaigns, and conditions of genuine deprivation. James Stockdale, a United States Navy admiral, was shot down over North Vietnam in 1965 and spent 7.5 years as a prisoner of war, including 4 years in solitary confinement and repeated torture. He later wrote extensively about how Stoic philosophy, specifically Epictetus, which he had studied at Stanford under the philosopher Philip Rhinelander, provided the framework that made his survival possible. Not comfortable survival, not survival without damage, but survival with his moral core intact, with his sense of who he was and what he owed his fellow prisoners preserved through conditions that were specifically designed to destroy exactly those things. He wrote that what the Vietnamese were trying to do was not primarily to hurt him, though they did, but to make him betray the people in his care. And what Epictetus had given him was not a technique for managing the pain of torture, though the distinction between what was and was not in his control was practically essential under those conditions. What Epictetus had given him was a clear account of what it actually meant to lose. Not the loss of physical comfort, not the loss of freedom of movement, not even the loss of health. The only genuine loss was the loss of integrity, the betrayal of the people who depended on him, the surrender of the inner standard that constituted who he actually was. With that clarity, the coercion lost a significant portion of its leverage. The captors could hurt him, and they did. They could humiliate him, and they did. They could take away every external comfort and every guarantee of safety, and they did. But they could not make losing any of those things equivalent to losing himself unless he made that equation. And he knew, with the precision that Epictetus had provided 20 centuries earlier, that the equation was his to make or refuse. This is the tradition at full strength, not the motivational summary, not the productivity tool, not the morning journaling practice or the two-circle diagram. The thing itself, applied under conditions of maximum pressure by a person who had practiced it with enough seriousness that it was available when everything else had been taken away. Stockdale's account, published in his 1993 book, Courage Under Fire, is one of the most direct and least romanticized pieces of testimony about what Stoic practice actually produces under conditions that genuinely test it. And what it shows is consistent with what the ancient lives showed, with what the convergent evidence from psychology and neuroscience shows. The practice does not eliminate suffering. It does not make external harm disappear. It creates and maintains, through sustained training under real conditions, a quality of inner orientation that the external harm cannot fully reach, not easily, not automatically, not without the kind of work that most people, in the absence of being shot down over a hostile country, may never feel sufficient urgency to do. But Stockdale's testimony also reveals something else, something that the more comfortable presentations of Stoicism consistently miss. He was not alone. In the prison camps, he organized a community of resistance among the prisoners, a covert structure of mutual accountability and support that was itself a form of the relational pedagogy the tradition had always required. He was not applying Stoicism in solitude to his individual survival. He was applying it in the context of obligations to others, of relationships that held him to his values more effectively than any private practice could have, of being witnessed by people whose estimation of him mattered in the deepest way. The philosophy, in other words, worked the way it was originally designed to work, in community, under pressure, with real accountability to real people, and in service of something larger than private equanimity. The Stoic cosmopolitan dimension, the insistence that the commitment to reason and virtue extends to all human beings equally, was not abstract for Stockdale in that prison. It was the immediate practical content of who he was responsible for, and why he could not betray them. This resolves the final loop. The question the documentary opened with, whether anything outside can truly harm you, now has the fullest answer the tradition can provide, and the answer is layered. At the most fundamental level, the level of the ruling faculty, of what you assent to and what you refuse, the answer is no, with the crucial qualification that this immunity is not given, but cultivated, not automatic, but earned through practice, and not available on demand from a philosophy read at a comfortable distance. It is available to anyone who practices it under conditions sufficiently close to real difficulty that the practice actually updates the automatic systems rather than merely decorating the conscious ones. At the level of the body, the relationships, the history, the community, external events cause genuine damage. genuine loss, genuine grief. The Stoics never denied this, whatever the simplified version suggests. What they denied is that this damage is the last word, that it reaches all the way down to the part of you that determines what it means and what you do with it. That part remains yours. More completely than anything else in your experience remains yours, even when everything else has been taken. And at the level of the tradition itself, the most honest thing to say is that Stoicism in its full form is harder to access than most of its contemporary presentations suggest. More demanding than most people are initially prepared for, and more effective under genuine pressure than the comfortable versions would lead you to expect. The gap between the popular presentation and the demanding reality is itself an invitation, not a disappointment. It points toward what the practice actually is, which is not a set of ideas to hold, but a set of capacities to develop. Capacities that take time, that require real conditions to test, that benefit enormously from the kind of accountability and community the texts alone cannot provide. The tradition has survived 2,300 years, not because it is comfortable or flattering, but because it keeps proving, in the lives of the people who actually practice it, rather than merely professing it, that there is something genuinely there, something that corresponds to a real feature of human experience rather than to a philosophical construction, the space between impression and response, the territory that belongs to you and that no external event can enter without your permission. Small, sometimes, difficult to maintain, requiring everything the practice asks of you, but real, and in the moments that matter most, sufficient. Marcus Aurelius died in 180 C on campaign on the Danube frontier, still attending to the business of the empire he had never wanted to rule, and never stopped trying to serve well. His final recorded words, according to ancient accounts, were addressed to the guard who came to his tent in the night. "Go to the rising sun," he said, "for I am already setting." Whatever those words mean, whatever state he was in when he said them, they belonged to a man who had spent decades writing to himself about how to die well, how to release attachment without resentment, how to see the end of a life as something the universe had always been moving toward, and that therefore required not resistance but recognition. He did not achieve the Stoic ideal, but by the evidence of his life and his private writing, he moved toward it with more sustained effort and more honest self-examination than almost anyone in the historical record. That effort, sustained over decades, under conditions that made it necessary rather than merely aspirational, is what the tradition is ultimately pointing at. Not an achievement, a direction, not a destination, a practice. And the practice begins not with understanding, but with the willingness to be honest about the distance between where you are and where the philosophy asks you to go. That honesty, uncomfortable and necessary, is itself the first movement of the training. The practice begins not with understanding, but with the willingness to be honest about the distance. That sentence is worth holding for a moment, because it does something unusual for a philosophical tradition that spent 3 centuries developing some of the most sophisticated arguments in ancient thought. It locates the beginning of wisdom not in intellectual achievement, but in a particular quality of honesty that is, in its own way, more demanding than any argument. Most people who encounter Stoicism come to it carrying some distance they are not fully willing to name. The distance between how they respond to difficulty and how they would like to respond. The distance between the values they articulate and the behavior those values would require. The distance between the equanimity they present to the world and the inner turbulence that continues underneath it. The philosophy does not ask you to close that distance immediately. It asks you to see it clearly. And the seeing, if it is genuinely honest rather than performed, is itself the beginning of the training. What the 2,300 years of this tradition reveal, taken as a whole rather than as a collection of quotable passages, is something more complex and more useful than the popular version suggests. The Stoics were not offering a technique for feeling better about a life left otherwise unchanged. They were describing a fundamental reorientation of what the self is and where it lives. The self they were pointing at is not the sum of your achievements, your reputation, your relationships, your health, or your circumstances. It is the quality of orientation you bring to all of those things. It is the character of your response to what happens rather than what happens. And that self, the one that lives in the quality of response rather than in the content of circumstances, is both more durable and more available than most people realize, until something takes away everything else. The durability is not comfortable to contemplate. It means that the self the Stoics are pointing at can survive conditions you would not choose and would not wish on anyone. It survived slavery in Epictetus. It survived war and plague and the deaths of children in Marcus Aurelius. It survived execution in Seneca. It survived 7.5 years of imprisonment and torture in Stockdale. In none of those cases did it survive intact in the simple sense of being undamaged. It survived in the deeper sense of remaining oriented, of retaining the capacity to act from values rather than from pure reaction, of not fully surrendering the inner space to what the outer conditions were demanding. That survival is not heroic in the way heroism is usually presented. It is not dramatic or photogenic. It is a very quiet, very sustained refusal to let the innermost room be entered by forces that have taken everything else. And the reason it is worth contemplating, particularly in the hours before sleep when the defenses are lowered and the day's unfinished business makes itself felt, is that the conditions that test it are not reserved for prisoners of war or Roman emperors. They are the ordinary conditions of any life lived long enough. Loss comes for everyone. Circumstances become difficult for everyone. The gap between what you expected and what arrives is a universal human experience, not an exceptional one. And the question of what you carry inside that gap, what inner resource is available to you when the comfortable versions of yourself are no longer sustainable, is not an abstract philosophical question. It is the most practical question available. The Stoics answered it with a practice rather than a promise. They did not say that if you study their philosophy you will be protected from harm or relieved of difficulty. They said that if you train consistently, under real conditions, with genuine accountability, you will develop something that functions in exactly the moments when nothing else does. And the historical evidence, from the ancient biographies to the modern testimonies, supports that claim with enough consistency to take seriously. What remains genuinely unresolved, and what the tradition has never fully answered, is the question of transmission. How do you give someone else access to what only experience can build? The texts carry the description. The techniques carry the method. But the thing itself, the trained capacity that functions under pressure, that exists in the body rather than in the understanding, that updates through practice rather than through reading, that requires community and accountability to develop fully, that thing cannot be handed from one person to another the way information can. It has to be grown, and growing it takes the one resource the modern world is most reluctant to spend, time, extended and unhurried, in genuine contact with difficulty, rather than in the management of it. This is perhaps the most important thing the Stoic tradition has to say to the present moment. Not the specific doctrines, not the categories, not the exercises. The deeper message is this: there is no shortcut to an inner life capable of withstanding what life eventually brings. The shortcut is the thing most people are looking for, and the tradition exists to tell you, with enormous patience and enormous precision, that the path runs through the difficulty rather than around it, that the training is the practice of being present in the hard moments rather than skillfully avoiding them, that the inner resource you are hoping to have available in your worst moment is built precisely by how you inhabit your difficult moments now, including this one, including whatever is present in the silence after these words stop. The Stoics would not end there. They would add the piece that their cosmopolitan ethics always required. The inner work is not only for yourself. A person who has genuinely developed the capacity to remain oriented under pressure, who has cultivated the inner space that external events cannot fully enter, does not become less connected to others. They become more available to them, because they are no longer spending most of their resources managing their own reactive system. They can be present for others in difficulty with something more useful than anxiety or avoidance. They can hold a steadier position in relationships that are going through turbulence, not because they are detached from the turbulence, but because they are not adding their own amplification to it. This is what the Stoic ideal of the sage was always pointing at, not a person who is unreachable because they feel nothing, a person who is more useful to the people around them because they have done sufficient work on their own interior that the interior is no longer the primary obstacle to genuine contact. That ideal, like all ideals, is a direction rather than a destination. But the direction is clear enough, and the evidence for movement in that direction is real enough, that the tradition remains worth engaging seriously, more seriously than most of its popular presentations invite. Tonight, as sleep approaches, the most Stoic thing you can do is not to resolve anything, or to declare any new intention, or to write down a quotation you want to remember tomorrow. The most Stoic thing available right now is simpler and more demanding than any of those. It is to be honestly present with whatever is actually here, without amplifying it through catastrophic interpretation, and without suppressing it through the performance of equanimity. To let what is difficult be difficult, without the additional weight of demanding that it be otherwise. To let what is uncertain remain uncertain, without the anxiety of requiring resolution before morning. To occupy, for these few quiet minutes before sleep, the small and genuinely available space between what has happened today and the story you are about to tell yourself about what it means. That space is what the Stoics were pointing at for 23 centuries. It has not grown smaller or less accessible with time. It is here now, in this moment, waiting with the patience of something that does not depend on circumstances to exist. If this documentary gave you something real to sit with tonight, consider subscribing so you do not miss what comes next, because the questions this tradition raises have no final resting place, and neither does the conversation worth having about them. The practice, as Marcus Aurelius reminded himself on a campaign in a tent somewhere along the Danube, does not end. It only deepens.